Okay, right. Recording has started.
Okay, it's being recorded.
Okay.
Okay, it's being recorded. Shall we start?
We should, otherwise we're going to run into delays afterwards.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Adele, for setting this up. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm 𝘁𝗵𝗲 from, although it says Susan Elliott here under my name, I'm actually not Susan Elliott speaking. It's 𝘁𝗵𝗲 here from 𝘁𝗵𝗲 Press. And I'd like to just very briefly welcome everyone here for the launch of Stories of Fathers, Stories of the Nation by Grant Andrews. And I'd especially like to welcome, of course, Grant himself, the author of the book, and then, of course, also Dr. Ilse Fouche, senior lecturer in the Division of Languages at Wits University, who will be here in discussion with Grant. I'd also like to welcome the, just mention, especially the staff of 𝘁𝗵𝗲 Press and Sally Hines, who was the managing editor on the book. Thanks for being here. And with that, let me hand over directly to Grant and Dr. Fouche.
Well, thanks so much for being here. I think it's a great turnout for social distancing, etc. So I want to start by just actually introducing Grant quickly to those of you who don't know him. There are several places here that I don't know. So Grant Andrews is a senior lecturer at the Wits School of Education in the Division of Languages, Literacies and Literature. His research interests include gender and sexuality in South African literature and film, as well as queer critical literacies in educational settings. Grant received his PhD at the University of the Western Cape in 2016. He worked at the University of
Has anyone else lost sound?
Yes, I can't hear anything.
Yes. Yeah.
No,
Grant,
I think we've all lost
Ilse,
sound.
I think it's from your side. Yeah, you need to unmute. Grant.
Grant, you are muted.
Is that better? Can you hear now?
Yeah, now you're back. Perfect.
Okay.
Are we audible?
Yes.
Okay, great. So Grant joined the University of the Witwatersrand in 2018, and since then he's collaborated on numerous research projects and published articles in South African and international journals, and he's worked on book projects. He is currently leading a research project funded by the National Research Foundation, which explores intersections between queer theory and queer visual culture in South Africa. As part of the project, he is directing a documentary on South African queer visual culture, which explores how academics, artists, and activists understand the term queer in relation to the lived realities of people from gender and sexual minority groups in South Africa. His book, entitled Stories of Fathers, Stories of the Nation, Fatherhood and Paternal Power in South African Literature, explores representations of fathers in select South African novels, published from the birth of apartheid to the post-transitional moment. Father figures in the texts reflect political and social climates in South Africa, at different times representing the oppressive apartheid government, righteous and authoritative liberation leaders, and the unfulfilled promise of a democratic South Africa. Grant examines how father characters are linked to storytelling. They narrate the lives of their children, and their patriarchal power is constituted through narratives. He features authors such as Alan Paton, Nadine Gordimer, Jane Coetzee, 𝘁𝗵𝗲 𝗁𝗁𝗁, Mark Burr, Zoe Wickham, Ilse Fouche, and 𝘁𝗵𝗲 𝗁𝗁𝗁. Stories of Fathers, Stories of the Nation also investigates how fatherhoods are being reimagined in light of shifting discourses of gender and identity. More recent novels have deconstructed the father figure and his paternal narrative power, representing conflict around racial identity, sexuality, legacy, and how the sins of the father are visited on his children. So I particularly enjoyed the preface to this book, and I've asked Grant whether he would, it's quite short, whether he would read that to us.
Happy to do so. Okay. So I also just want to thank everyone for being here. It means a lot that everyone is supporting this book launch today, and I hope you enjoy the event today. So in South African literature, the father reflects the nation. Of course, this is not uniquely South African literary tradition. Fathers have been used in almost all storytelling patriarchal societies to reflect their cultural values and to prescribe the ways of living and being for their groups. Father figures are often the center of founding myths and narratives of independence in many nations, and they are given moral authority, agency, and dominance in stories. In fact, the image of the righteous and dominant father is ubiquitous, from oral traditions in Africa to fairy tales from Europe and the Middle East. For example, the West African folklore character Anansi, who is both rebellious son and authoritative father, is conceived of as the god of knowledge and stories. The Middle Eastern collection 1001 Nights uses the framing story of the character Sharia, who is prevented from executing the bride Scheherazade through being distracted by the series of stories. And in European fairy tales such as Rumpelstiltskin by the brothers Grimm, the fate of a daughter is dictated by a story told by her father, that she can spin straw into gold. These stories of fathers across cultures, countries, and historical epochs have many overlaps. The father's power is constituted through and negotiated around narratives. The stories he weaves or is enmeshed in are often these stories would have major consequences for his sons and daughters. These stories seem to reflect the patriarchal values and the authority of and centrality of the male figures as designers, creators, and gatekeepers of knowledge and meaning. Many of these stories too come to define cultures, and they were told to children and members of cultural groups as ways of maintaining traditions and identity. Stories of fathers were also foundational for how many cultures saw themselves or were seen in the world. In Greece, Egypt, or Rome, the father figures Zeus, Osiris, and Jupiter, and their offspring in constant conflict with their dominance were foundational to cultural stories. For much of recorded history, the father in narrative is the embodiment of authority, justice, violence, and control. This book originated from my interest in understanding the role of the father figure in South African literature and how the major political shifts in the country affected the image of the father. Could new states of the nation impact on how the father is represented? Could the father come to mean different things in literary texts based on political and social shifts, especially during the seismic movements from pre-apartheid to apartheid eras, then to states of emergency, mass protests and violent uprisings, and then to the transitional and post-transitional eras. I look at how stories of fathers reflect states of the nation, and how these narratives serve to grapple with social and political changes in relation to power dynamics in South Africa. Sons, predominantly, are used in these various texts to reflect the power of the fathers, and they are able to reproduce the paternal narratives in ways that show symbols of power. These transmissions of power through symbols are very similar to how political and social enculturation take place in the highly patriarchal South African society. Sports, the military, guns, religion, and other male-dominated domains symbolize how sons take up the mantle of patriarchal roles and values from fathers. These narratives, just like the historical myths and fables described above, show the passing on of power from father to son, with daughters and mothers often secondary, controlled, and narrated characters. This book looks critically at how fathers are reflected in English novels during different periods, starting with Alan Paton's 𝘁𝗵𝗲 𝗏𝗏, where the central fathers are represented as morally unyielding leaders capable of healing a nation that is descending into apartheid divisions. And it ends with texts in the post-transitional period where fathers are represented very differently. In recent texts, fathers are spectral, dying, and morally bankrupt. Sons and daughters are given centrality in these narratives, and they can distance themselves from the stifling influence of their fathers. What these texts show, through gradual changes influenced by, and perhaps influencing, massive social shifts, is the uncertainty surrounding paternal narratives. These narratives might be failing a nation that has never truly redefined itself or truly healed after the pain and trauma of apartheid. I wanted to write this book as a longitudinal study of what fathers have meant in the popular imaginary. How fathers were able to act as the voice of different groups within South Africa, either representing racist and exploitative power or the power of resistance and revolt. I drew on theories of narrative and theories of gender to conceive of the narrative power of fathers. I, however, did not want to flatten interpretations of these texts by forcing them through a narrow lens, but instead I wanted to see how these could speak to one another and offer insights into the anxieties, conflicts, and the disruptive moments that define each era, and the tensions that still characterize representations in South Africa today. For example, how does a white author write a black character? And whose voice does this capture? How do African cultures and literary traditions allow for rethinking realism and magical realism? What was the influence of the global women's liberation movement on literature in South Africa? How do descendants of those who voted for and fought for apartheid see themselves in post-transitional South Africa? How do Black queer characters see themselves in a society where their identities are marginalized? While these might seem disparate questions, unable to be woven together in any meaningful way through a project on paternal narratives, I answer that they can all be spoken to through how we imagine father. The father is Paton, who writes his white liberalism into the characters of 𝘁𝗵𝗲 𝗏𝗏. The father is Mark Bear's male relative, who recruited him as an apartheid spy, written obliquely through his paternal characters in the 𝘁𝗵𝗲 and 𝘁𝗵𝗲𝗀. The father is 𝘁𝗵𝗲, who imagines himself as a gentle and loving guardian to the children of South Africa, and to himself through the character of 𝘁𝗵𝗲 in the 𝘁𝗵𝗲𝗀. These children might be the queer South African students who picked up his book and saw themselves represented for the first time, as I did many years ago, and the Black writers who pay tribute to his enduring legacy. The fathers in these texts fascinate me, how they speak to what South Africa was, is, and what it might become. When the images were violent, dangerous, and threatening, they could symbolize fears about moral ambiguities in the face of social changes, the prevalence of toxic masculinities, or the horrors of rape and domestic violence that South African women and children endure at the hands of men. When the images were gentle, introspective, and seeking redemption, they could speak to new possibilities for men to redefine themselves. They could speak to new possibilities for challenging restrictive gender norms that harm them, and to find loving ways to understand their diversity in sexuality, parenting styles, and racial and cultural identities, especially in post-apartheid South Africa. I argue in this book that the stories of fathers can be read as stories of confronting and defining the nation and national identity. And I read these stories here in ways that are cognizant of and simultaneously seek to challenge what paternal narratives have traditionally meant. Importantly, despite the traditional conception that the father's power is univocal, despite understanding the father as all-powerful, the South African imaginary shows multiple, diverse images of fathers. These multiple stories offer possibilities for productive new meanings, rereadings, and counter-readings that offer a reimagining of South Africa's story. Perhaps, too, fatherhood in South African society might be seen through new lenses, which offer men and fathers the chance to forge new meanings and new stories of themselves.
So how we're going to structure this is I'm going to use my privilege of sitting here in front to first ask Grant a few questions. And when I'm done, then I'll open it to the floor, both the physical floor and the electronic floor today. And this is the virtual book which I've ever attended. So Grant, what inspired you to write about fatherhood in South African literature?
I think growing up as a queer person, it's very interesting to think about gender in these deconstructed terms. You're always kind of questioning your place in a very patriarchal society and experiencing patriarchy and violence and the story of men, what men are imagined as. And growing up in a society that was very socioeconomically disadvantaged, there were many fathers who were absent, many fathers who were violent. So my image of fathers has been great.
Can you just maybe share with us where you did grow up?
I grew up in 𝘁𝗵𝗲 in the Western Cape, close to Cape Town. My own father was a loving, he is a loving and kind, generous man, putting other people before himself, and seeing this image of my father, who is a role model to me, versus how fathers are represented when you question what is fatherhood. And also kind of imagining myself as a father one day, the type of father I'd like to be. Growing up in a society where fathers were imagined in these ways, when you question what I had been reading, what I had been seeing, and all of these types of representations of masculinity in general. So I loved reading these books. I really
You muted again.
Grant, could you?
Thank you. Sorry about that. Yes, please alert us if that happens. I could see these moments of challenging gender norms and myself wanting to be a different kind of man and a different kind of father. So these stories really appealed to me, and even in the sometimes limiting forms of representations of masculinity, there were these glimmers of progressive masculinities, which I love. And I think particularly reading 𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁 novels during my kind of formative academic years, and reading these novels of men who don't know their place in South African society and traditional cultures and patriarchal cultures, kind of let me know that this questioning was happening quite broadly. So I was interested to explore that. And I hope that I've kind of shown this trajectory of where fatherhood was seen as something really static and really singular to something where fatherhood can be seen as something open and progressive.
I thought that it's fascinating. Back to where we're positioned my father is. Now, I think South Africa is facing so many challenges at the moment. Anything from nurturing to Joburg not having water next week, and we're facing really stark realities. Do you think, and why do you think stories are still important in the South African reality?
I think it's a really good question. It's something that kind of, I think a lot of us, so living in Joburg and South Africa in general, I think you become quite numb to the realities of what's going on around you quite often, and you ignore toxic masculinity, and there's another protest and more things are happening. And you don't personalize a lot of the big institutional things happening around you. And for me, film and literature and these types of things, and listening to personal stories also, can shake you sometimes and shake you out of that slumber that a lot of us find ourselves in, because we do become numb at times. So I think stories, and what I found in these stories that I speak about in my book, And what I find in stories that are being produced now by younger South African artists is this real opening up of this is what's happening. These are the wounds that we're dealing with. These are the joys that we're dealing with. And there are a lot of joys as well that we might also kind of gloss over. So stories for me and the novels that have really stuck with me that I've written about and the films that I'm busy researching now have opened up these avenues of empathy and compassion and rethinking my own identity, rethinking my own expression of masculinity. And I hope that storytelling can become or can remain. I think it's very strong in South Africa currently. I've read some beautiful texts and watched some beautiful films recently. And I hope that it can remain this thing that keeps us conscious of what's happening with ourselves and also what's happening with our neighbors.
That's really interesting. Maybe these stories are actually emerging because of the challenges. They're also being allowed to. So
conflict breeds creativity.
Yes. Okay. So maybe almost a follow-up question is this book is about fatherhood, and I was wondering in a time where we are increasingly consciously foregrounding women's voices. Why did you choose to write about masculinity and fatherhood specifically?
Yeah, so I think there are kind of layers to this answer. Obviously, it is a very appropriate and correct thing that we're doing as a world to recognize gender differences, to recognize the way that women are treated differently from men in societies, and to advocate for the voices of women to be taken as central in many ways and taken as voices that we take seriously. And I think there are common discourses, and I look at politics around the world, and I look at politics in South Africa as well. There are common discourses that men feel excluded, whether these are right or wrong, and it erupts into horrible kind of manifestations like Donald Trump, or young men feeling like they're not heard. And I think this is for a very long time in South Africa and everywhere in the world been excluded as an academic pursuit. It's been excluded as, let's really investigate masculinity as something that is also socially constructed, as something that is not neutral, as something that is informed and shaped by the society that it's found in. And particularly I was interested in masculinities in South Africa because of our violent past and our violent present. And because of the cries and the horrific effects of toxic masculinity on women in South Africa. But I wanted a story, I really wanted, and I hope this is my through line in the book, I really hope this is what comes through. I wanted a story of men who are seeking, and men who are open, and men who are loving, and men who are good, because I don't think it's a story that is often acknowledged. It might be a story that's often told, but and there are so many beautiful, wonderful men at the forefront also, alongside women, marching and fighting for equality and writing beautiful things like my colleagues, my male colleagues, as well, about new stories of South Africa. And I think these voices are worthy of being acknowledged. And I really wanted to look at where we've come from, and I wanted to see where we could go, as well as what's happening right now. So these stories, many of them written by men, and some of them written by women about fathers that are in some ways autobiographical, in some ways completely just fictionalized of looking at what's happening in South Africa. I think these stories can tell us something about men in South Africa right now, and I wanted to bring that out in the book.
Now, this is obviously not a fiction book. It is a non-fiction book. Writing about fiction.
Yeah.
What do you envisage the impact of this book to be? About literature and transitioning in South Africa. What do you hope this to bring to the conversation? So
first of all, I hope people actually read my book. Thinking of big term impact, what I wanted this book to say, and what I want this book to mean, and what this book means to me, and what all the research that has led up to this book has meant to me was, I mean, it's very personal. I don't know if you can do this many years of research without it kind of deeply affecting you, but I wanted really to mean, what can the face of new fathers be? And I think 𝘁𝗵𝗲 𝗡𝗁 has done a fantastic job of representing this new South African father, this black, urban, middle class, or rural, or this father who grapples with, what does masculinity ask of me, but what am I going to do anyway, even if it's asking things that I don't want to deliver. And that's where I want you to come from. That's where I hope I end up at the end of it. And the white person who has parents who were fighting in the border war, or who has parents who have voted for apartheid, who maybe is old enough to have voted for apartheid governments himself, to question, what kind of father am I going to be to my family when my children are in these multicultural settings, when they are thinking in these different ways from what I've ever thought possible for people to think. So what does that father look like? And that's, I hope I painted a bit of a picture of that, drawing on these fantastic novels that I've used. But it is an ongoing project. It's something I'm still interested in, something I'm still researching. But hopefully this opens the door a bit, and when people read this, they think South African fathers can be multiple, they can be all of these different things at the same time.
Well, I'm going to interject with a personal note here, because I'm thinking of my own son, who doesn't have a father, he has a mother. But he has many father figures, and I think Grant is one of those father figures. Men who play a really important role in his life, and I think what you just described is exactly that. It's wonderful, multiple fathers who are reimagining themselves, none of them resembling my own father, and that very patriarchal tradition.
Yeah.
And I think that's wonderful that this is what we're moving towards. I see my son growing up without having any idea what toxic masculinity is. It's definitely not part of his life at the moment at all. So I think that's really exciting, and it also showed the whole transition to how we got to the place where that's possible.
Yeah, I just want to add to that this is an important transition in fatherhood because of single mother households, because of grandparent-led households, and often grandmother-led households, which is the vast majority of South African households. Looking at father figures who are not biological father figures was also a part of the later chapters of this book, and saying the father can be this figure of love and attention and being there for someone without just being this biological, stern, rigid character that it's often been seen as. So yeah, that's hopefully also part of that.
So then the final question, but related to that, is who was your favorite father figure in the novels that you've done?
Yeah, tough choice. I love 𝘁𝗵𝗲. I think her writing is absolutely fantastic at capturing South African tensions that are not spoken about, especially around colored communities. And I think the character of John Campbell in playing white, for me, this father who had played white, but was in fact colored, and really representing so much of that, the tensions. This was a favorite father figure of mine, even though he was a bit of a curse word, which I'm not going to say out loud. So not a likable character, not a character that would be well written in the history of South Africa, not someone that we would look at as progressive in any way, but someone who was challenged by the child and was open to the challenge. And I love that. I think that for me was the space of kind of shifting fatherhood in some way, and really opening space for, let me listen to voices from younger people, listen to voices that I never even thought of. Non-racist voices, because this character is extremely racist despite being someone from an oppressed race who denies that about himself. So I think those kinds of really complicated fatherhoods and being able to write that in a story, for me, is something that we need more of, and that I just think South Africa does brilliantly. But obviously, Sally Baker as well, and lots of these fathers are just so powerful, and 𝘁𝗵𝗲 in writing about new progressive fatherhoods. So all of these things kind of open up the spaces for what fatherhood could look like.
As you're speaking, I keep thinking of the government as a father figure, and I'm wondering how that's progressing as well. Recent elections and how things are being challenged, and I find it absolutely fascinating, this connection between fatherhood and the state of the nation, I guess.
Yeah.
So
now I do write very early on in the book also about 𝘁𝗵𝗲 and Jacob Zuma as a father figure, and how kind of national ideas of fathers and politics have shifted. And I think that's a big reason why the father has become this character that's left out in a lot of South African literature, or the character that is backgrounded, or the character that is spectral and dying. He's a relic of the past in some ways, and it's a disillusionment with government, which I think informs a lot of that, and it's a yearning for something new, which hopefully comes. Some kind of new, loving and nurturing father figure that can hopefully take us into a new phase of South African history.
Great. So on that note, I want to open up questions to the floor. Anyone wants to ask Grant something?
Or our Zoom friends. Yes, please.
I don't have anything to ask, but I'd like to make comments. Congratulations. I'm so proud of you, and I'm sure the entire division is very proud of you. I know I'm thrilled. I love the title. I love your image. I mean, what's happening about it? The cover is amazing. And I have to say how fascinated I am, because I think men are somehow, because of their very negative attitudes towards them, you know, the way things are, they're being foregrounded so negatively. And I like the idea that now we will be foregrounded when we spoke about the positives. It's nice to see that there are beautiful men out there too. You know, so no, I'm looking forward to reading. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Liz. Thank you. So this is the impact.
Grant, just want to say congratulations on the book. It really is an excellent work of scholarship. And I think one of the contributions it really makes in terms of literary studies and cultural studies is that the methodology of reading literary texts and using those texts to theorize new ways of being. And I think in that way, it's such an interdisciplinary project that really gives us, it may be grounded in literary texts, but it gives us so many conceptual tools to think around literature and culture, but also around social and political issues. And I think that's one of the huge strengths of the book. So congratulations.
Thank you. Okay. Yes, Anna.
Okay, so this is actually a question. Although I start by saying many congratulations. It's so exciting. I'm so looking forward to reading it and putting it on my shelf. So beautiful. And I'm wondering if it sounds like your focus is literary, obviously, but I know you also have an interest in film, and I was wondering if you had thought about how these father tropes, this analysis of fatherhood that you do literarily is manifesting itself in films, in the South African landscape, or beyond, and you've given that any thought?
I have quite a bit. Yes, I think it's so it's definitely taking what I've started doing in the book and moving it forward into where I'm going now. So my NRF project is actually just looking at visualities and looking at visual representations. And there is quite a lot about fatherhood because of how fascinating for me right now, queer film, with those representations of fathers in those queer films. So it started off with 𝘁𝗵𝗲, which I think, it became such a lightning rod of the film. This person who is a father, but is this closeted gay man, and still has these racist ideas and these terribly patriarchal ideas. And in a way where identities can be so complex in this post-apartheid situation. Right? You would think someone who is same-sex attracted or from a marginalized sexuality group might be more progressive in their thinking about these other identities. And this has been the conflict, I think, and it's been quite a generational conflict between fathers and often sons in film, particularly. And some recent films that have been just fantastic in terms of representing this. There were some great things in 𝘁𝗵𝗲 𝗀𝗀. There were some lovely things that I saw in the film by 𝘁𝗵𝗲 as well, which I'm not sure was also quite a big film. Also looking at different types of fathers. So in terms of race, in terms of intergenerational differences, a lot of these things are coming out in film. And the framework that I've built here is definitely opening up to looking at how films, and I think it's quite exciting. There's a lot of public discourse around what types of masculinities are represented in these films, especially in 𝘁𝗵𝗲. There was a lot of contention and pushback because some men or some male-driven institutions don't want to see these types of representations. They don't want to see masculinity. There's a big kind of discourse about the threats to masculinity now, right? Masculinity is so under threat, so we should all be careful of our men becoming feminized or whatever. So it's interesting to look at that in the face of all of these very progressive and interesting ways that masculinity is being reimagined and the type of pushback that comes against it. That is the Donald Trump that I was speaking about, all the right-wing movements in much of the world right now, unfortunately, because this progressive type of look at type of view of gender might be taking place in public popular representations.
In fact, in relation to popular representations, it would be interesting to look at fathers and 𝗁𝗍𝗍𝗍 because it's such a popular text type and see what happens there.
Absolutely. I've been thinking a bit about 𝘁𝗵𝗲 which lots of people are. And it's such a huge show in South Africa right now. I think there's lots of stuff about masculinity. So I was chatting with Ilse about actually kind of thinking about that more. What it says about men and fatherhood to be represented in ways with gay characters or with characters who can't fulfill these family expectations, etc. But it's still so popular. It's still so widely viewed. So all those shifting ways that we think about men. Yes, Martina.
I do have, I do want to speak to what he said about the conceptual groundings. And one thing your book gives me is the fluidity of power. So you did speak of 𝘁𝗵𝗲𝗀𝗀's dad being this very complex human being. And you did speak of different men being complex. And I think of my father and think of times where I just hate him, and times where I'm like, okay, and other times where I think I need to be more empathetic because of obviously the generational divide. And it makes me think of the conceptual idea of assemblages and fluidity within power, that even if you're a queer person or you're a Black person or you're a colored person, there are different times you're vulnerable to different things because of your complex identity. And that's one thing that gives me. So I'm looking forward to reading it.
Great. Yeah, I'm thinking in terms of what you're saying. We just had a father figure die yesterday or the day before. This very complex person who many of us hate and many of us think was fantastic and won the Nobel Prize. And I don't think it's possible really for me to have read this literature without thinking of two elements. I think of my own father and father figures, my grandparents, and I think of myself as a father. So you always think of this kind of, when you're reading these texts, which I like so much, there is this sense of how am I the same or different or moving to new spaces. So this fluidity of power that you're speaking about, and patriarchy is such a powerful drug. It's difficult to imagine yourself outside of it sometimes, but it's necessary. So I hope that speaking about these texts in this way and hopefully people are reading all of these wonderful novels as well, and seeing the films that are being produced now can open up spaces for thinking about this word. Yeah, but father figures are always complex figures in South Africa. I still don't know what to think of Rebecca de Klerk. I don't know how to reconcile that final message that we listen to with what is done.
What's really interesting about that is I've stopped following news. I felt that it's not great for my mental health in general. So I follow Facebook. That's where I get news. And I happened to see one story about him. It wasn't anywhere on my feed at all, which I found quite fascinating. It was almost to me a type of interesting, purposeful silencing of the specific father figure. This is now from a very small perspective, but I just didn't know about it.
It's a forgotten father in a way, the kind of father we want to push in the corner and not think about. But what was the role? And
anyone else? Any of our
I'm
Zoom?
not sure if there are any questions on the Zoom line. Could you check if there's a chat? Is anything posted?
Nothing has come up yet.
Thanks, Adele.
But I'm hoping that someone will. I'll just get this. It's all face at the corner of the screen.
Someone's now asking if they could ask a question, so they're more than welcome.
Yes.
Sure. Yeah. Can we turn on microphones and you can hear quite clearly, so they're welcome to ask a question. Facing the corner.
The challenge is how we
You just need to unmute yourself. If you're asking a question, just unmute yourself.
So they're waiting to be unmuted, but we can't unmute from our side.
I thought I'd change that. Okay, I'll try. Do you have the name of the person?
I don't want to block it is 𝘁𝗵𝗲
Okay.
If you could just unmute her.
Yeah, I've asked to unmute. There we go.
Okay. I have been unmuted. And I'm going to turn on my video also so that Grant can see me. Hi, Grant. You know me better as Fiona from UWC, but my UWC system calls up my full first and second names, and yeah, so that's why I'm listed as Fatima.
Okay, I'm happy to see you.
Yeah, and nice to see you again. You're looking very well. The question I wanted to ask is, you said at the outset of your talk that father figures were sort of predominantly linked in a kind of with a national symbolic, that the patriarchal father figure is probably the most potent allegory of the nation. With our current sort of transition to the increasing prevalence of sort of transnational questions and concerns and movements and so on, what would you say is happening to that, to the allegory of the father as father of the nation in relation to questions of transnationalism?
Yeah. Thanks very much, Fiona. I think that's a really good question, and transnationalism does come out quite a lot, I'd say, in the final chapter of the book, especially with Mark Beer, who I think is just a fantastic writer. I really love Kings of the Water. He has this transnational character who left South Africa, which is a common story, so leaving the country and then coming back. And this idea of coming back is often also linked to the father. Right, you're coming back to home, but you're coming back to the father's influence. And Mark Beer does that in a very interesting way, where it's a queer character. But the father becomes such a relic of the past in that text. The father is very old and dying, and I think, so what I'm seeing in terms of fathers now, and I think 𝘁𝗵𝗲 does this as well in Men of the South, that fathers, at least fathers who were born during the apartheid period, born before the 1980s, those fathers are seen as completely out of touch in a lot of these texts. And those fathers are almost the enemy of the progressive younger people and these transnational younger people as well. So the immigrant Zimbabwean character in Men of the South becomes a very different kind of father who also thinks about things very differently. And 𝘁𝗵𝗲 sees his father in these very patriarchal ways where he can never reconcile. There's no reconciliation in this. So it does seem that this transnational trend seems to be a cutting off with the past in some ways, and a cutting off with traditional masculinity, and this wanting for a more progressive world in masculinity, which does kind of speak to what fatherhood has become in recent South African culture and texts. Okay, thanks very much for that, Fiona. Are there any other questions that we can, before we end up this one?
Just huge congratulations.
Thank you.
I started reading it and I'm really enjoying it, and I think it's very interesting work. And I also think that this is the best academic book cover I've ever seen. And
You just stole my last question.
I know, sorry, my question is, can you tell us more about the cover? I just think it's
I think it's such it's ฤtha 𝘁𝗵𝗲, who is a South African artist who was generous enough to let us use the cover, the image for the cover. And the image is actually about this confluence of masculinity and femininity. So apparently this is an image that captures the feminine, but the stronger side of femininity and the side of the masculine in the feminine, which I think is so great. And kind of, for me, cuts both ways, which is why I love it so much. And it says, can there be this? And I don't like this binary speak often. I don't like to speak of masculine and feminine often, but I feel like there still is some power in thinking in those terms of choosing for duality and choosing for a sense of openness to identity being whatever it is to you. So that's where it's powerful to me. And I just think the kind of look of love and yearning and openness and all of those things captured in this image for me spoke to what I wanted to think of in terms of fathers. So I'm very grateful that this image was allowed for our cover, but I think it speaks to a lot of our things. I don't remember the title of the image, but I will post it.
does such different things to what academic book covers usually do, It's kind of humanizing, it's emotional, it's all animus.
Yes.
All the things you try to do in the book,
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I hope it's accessible in that way in the book as well. So that's why the cover's for.
Yeah.
So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah. I really appreciate everyone coming out today. I think, in terms of Adele, you want to add something before we end off?
No, I was just going to check if there weren't any other questions, because people should be able to unmute themselves now.
Okay. If there is any other questions from the Zoom, I'm happy to. But yeah, just to really thank everyone for coming through.
Okay, no. Okay, I've just got a message saying that people can't unmute themselves. I thought I'd change the setting. So if anyone can just type any questions. Okay, is there someone?
My husband is kind enough to read questions for us.
No, there aren't any questions. Great.
Okay. Yes, and then I just want to really thank Adele and Deborah for organizing all of this and making it hybrid, and kind of bringing this book to life and helping with the marketing. I'm very grateful. I'm grateful to Ilse for being here and for asking me such good and challenging questions, and to all of my colleagues, friends, and students, and everyone who means something to me being here, for the live and for the virtual launch. I really appreciate all of you, and please read my book and enjoy it. Thank you so much.
Okay, before we go, I'm just wanting to thank everyone for attending, and also to thank NIHSS for supporting, and without whom we wouldn't be able to have had this book published. So we're very grateful to them as well.
Thanks so much. Okay, thanks so much, everyone.
Okay.
Some snacks at the back for everyone who's here physically.
Eat, enjoy, drink. There's wine, there's juice, there's... Yes, I will. Yes, that's a good idea. Thank you, Adele.
Thank you, Grant, and thank you for setting it up. Because I was worried initially about how you and Ilse were going to have a conversation. So the technical guys behind this, a big thank you to them as well.
Yes, we've recorded it so we can post it afterwards as well. So.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Cheers.
Thanks again, and everyone have a good weekend.
You too. Cheers.
Bye.
Friday.